They didn't just kill my trees, they tried to erase my view, my income, and 25 years of work like it was nothing more than brush in their way. And the worst part is, they almost got away with it. I didn't realize what they'd done at first, and honestly that's what still bothers me sometimes. How something so deliberate can hide behind something that looks so ordinary. My name's Caleb Harper, and I've been working the same land outside of Red Hollow, Oregon since I was a kid back when my dad still had the place, and I thought pruning trees was the worst punishment a human being could endure. It's 18 acres, all apples, planted back in 1991, mostly Honeycrisp and a few old Macintosh rows along the lower slope where the soil holds moisture better. Those trees aren't just decoration, they're not some postcard view, they're my entire livelihood. By the time all this started, those trees were in their prime, strong trunks, deep roots, producing heavy every season like clockwork. Another 20 years in them easy, maybe more if you treat them right. The land slopes down into a valley that opens up like something out of a travel brochure, especially early morning when the fog hangs low and the sunlight cuts through it in these soft gold bands. People driving past would slow down sometimes, roll their windows down, take pictures, and I never minded that. I was proud of it. That view, those trees, it felt like something I built with my own hands, even if I knew my dad laid the foundation long before me. Now, about a year before everything went sideways, a development company bought the property uphill from mine. That land had been sitting untouched for years. Old logging scars, overgrown brush, nothing special. Until suddenly it became the future site of something called Pine Ridge Retreat. Luxury cabins, private spa, curated farm-to-table dining. The whole polished brochure version of authentic rural living that people from the city eat up without ever thinking about what it actually takes to keep land alive. That's when I first met Darren Cole. He showed up in a truck so clean it didn't belong anywhere near dirt roads, stepped out wearing boots that had never seen mud and a jacket that probably cost more than my tractor payment. He smiled like we were already friends, stuck his hand out, and said, "Caleb, right? Darren Cole. I'm heading up development on Pine Ridge." I shook his hand, and right away I got that feeling, you know the one, where someone's being polite, but they're not really seeing you. Like you're part of the landscape to them, not a person standing in front of them. We talked for a bit, or really, he talked. Told me about the cabins, the investors, the experience they were building. And then he said something that stuck with me, though I didn't realize how much at the time. He looked out over my orchard, down toward the valley, and said, "Once we clear the upper line, our guests are going to have an unobstructed view straight through here. It's going to be incredible." I remember nodding, just kind of shrugging it off. My trees were on my land. His project was on his. That's how it works, right? Boundaries mean something. For a while, nothing really changed. I'd hear machinery up there some mornings, see survey flags, crews moving through brush, but that's normal with any development. I stayed busy with my own work, pruning, irrigation checks, prepping for the next season. Then midsummer rolled around, and that's when things started feeling off. At first, it was just one tree. Leaves turning brown way too early, right in the middle of July when everything should have been deep green and thriving. I figured maybe it caught a disease, happens sometimes. You lose one, maybe two, you manage it. But then another tree went, and another. Not in a random pattern either. They were clustered along the upper edge of my orchard, the side that borders their property. That's when the knot in my stomach started tightening. I walked the rows more carefully after that, checking leaves, digging around roots, trying to figure out what I was missing. The trees weren't just stressed, they looked poisoned, though I didn't want to say that out loud yet. It felt like accusing someone without proof, and out here, you don't throw accusations around lightly. So I called in an arborist, a guy named Miguel Alvarez, been doing tree diagnostics longer than I've been running this place. He came out early one morning, walked the orchard with me, crouched down at the base of a few dying trees, rubbed soil between his fingers, cut into roots, took samples without saying much. That silence, that's what got to me. Finally, I asked him, "What do you think?" He stood up, brushed his hands off, and said, "I'll know more after I run tests. But this doesn't look natural, Caleb." 2 weeks later, he called me. I was out fixing a broken irrigation line when my phone buzzed. I remember staring at it for a second before answering, like I already knew I wasn't going to like what he had to say. "Yeah," I said. There was a pause on the other end, and then Miguel goes, "It's herbicide. and not the kind that just drifts over by accident. Everything in me went quiet after that. He explained the concentration levels, high enough to kill deep-rooted trees, applied recently, not months ago, and then he said the part that made my jaw tighten. The contamination pattern, it's coming from uphill. I didn't say anything for a second. I didn't have to, because we both knew what was uphill. I walked that fence line that same afternoon, slow, methodical, looking at everything like I was seeing it for the first time. On their side, the land had been cleared clean, no brush, no stumps, just bare earth like it had been wiped smooth. And right along the edge, you could see where the spraying didn't stop. It crossed over into my trees. 10 of them were already dead by then, completely gone, and more were starting to show the same signs. I stood there for a long time, just staring at that line, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger yet, not fully, more like a realization settling in. This wasn't an accident, and whoever did it thought I wouldn't notice. Or worse, thought I wouldn't fight back. I didn't call anyone right away, not Darren, not the county, not even Miguel again. I just stood there for a while, boots in the dirt, staring at that invisible line where their land ended and mine began. Except it didn't feel like a boundary anymore. It felt like a decision had been made up there without me, like someone looked down at my orchard and decided it was negotiable. By the next morning, 10 dead trees had turned into 15 that were clearly on their way out. Leaves curling in on themselves, fruit dropping early, branches losing that tension you get from something alive and holding on. If you've never worked land, it's hard to explain, but you can feel it when something's dying. It changes the air around it. I grabbed my phone and called Darren. He picked up on the third ring, background noise behind him, voices, machinery, like I was interrupting something more important. Caleb, hey man, what's up? I didn't bother easing into it. You spraying herbicide up there? There was a beat. Not long, just enough. We cleared some brush along the ridge, yeah? What? You didn't just clear brush, I said, trying to keep my voice level. You killed 15 of my trees, mature trees, Darren. Another pause, this one a little tighter. Well, if anything drifted over, it wasn't intentional, he said, tone shifting into something rehearsed, like he'd already decided how this conversation would go. These things happen with wind sometimes. These things. I repeated, looking out at rows I'd spent years tending. That's not drift. That's concentrated application. Look, I'll talk to the landscaping crew, see what they used, he said, already sounding like he was stepping away from the problem. We'll figure it out. No. I cut in sharper now. You're going to do more than figure it out. You're going to fix it. He exhaled, not apologetic, just annoyed. Caleb, let's not jump to conclusions here. And that was it. That was the moment something in me flipped. Not loud, not explosive, just a quiet, solid shift. Yeah, I said, calm now, we won't. I hung up before he could respond. That afternoon, I started documenting everything, and I mean everything. Every dead tree, every leaf pattern, soil discoloration, the direction of the slope, the spacing between affected rows. I took photos from multiple angles, time-stamped them, even marked positions on an old field map my dad used to keep in the barn. Then I went further. I took my own soil samples, bagged and labeled them carefully, noting exact locations. If this turned into something bigger, and by then I knew it would, I wasn't going to rely on just one report. That's when I called Rachel Bennett. Rachel wasn't just any attorney. She grew up 2 counties over. Family ran cattle. She understood land in a way most lawyers don't. When I walked into her office and laid everything out, Miguel's report, my photos, the samples, I watched her face change about halfway through. She didn't interrupt, just flipped through pages slowly, then leaned back in her chair and said, "This isn't accidental overspray." I nodded. That's what Miguel said. She tapped the report with her pen. No, this is targeted. The concentration alone tells me that. You don't get this kind of saturation unless someone's trying to clear something thoroughly. Clear what? I asked, even though I already knew. She gave me a look. Your view. That word sat heavy in the room. Rachel didn't waste time after that. She pulled property records, zoning permits, environmental filings for Pine Ridge Retreat, digging into everything Darren and his investors had submitted to get that project approved. Within a day, she had a timeline mapped out, when clearing started, what chemicals were likely used, who the contracted applicators were. And then she made the first move I didn't expect. She called the State Department of Agriculture. 3 days later, an investigator showed up at my gate. Name was Tom Hensley, mid-50s, sunburned neck, boots that looked like they'd actually worked for a living. He didn't say much at first, just walked the property with me, same way Miguel had, but slower, more deliberate, like he was building a case in his head. He took his own samples, multiple points along the upper boundary, then further down into the orchard, checking how far the contamination spread. He asked questions, simple ones, but precise. When I first noticed symptoms, how quickly they progressed, wind conditions over the past few weeks. Then we walked up to the fence line. He stood there for a while, looking at the cleared slope above, then down at my trees, and I saw it in his expression, that subtle tightening around the eyes. "You been up there?" he asked. "Yesterday," I said. He nodded, then stepped over the boundary without hesitation, crouched down, ran his hand through the soil on their side, then crossed back, did the same on mine. "Yeah," he muttered under his breath. "What?" I asked. He stood up, wiped his hands on his jeans. This wasn't drift. Hearing it from him, that made it real in a different way. Over the next week, things started moving fast. The Department of Agriculture issued a formal notice of violation to Pine Ridge, citing improper herbicide application, damage to adjacent agricultural property, failure to contain chemical spread. Darren called me the same day that notice hit. His tone had changed. "Caleb. Hey. Listen, we got some paperwork from the state, and I think things might be getting blown out of proportion here." I leaned against the barn door, phone pressed to my ear. "Blown out of proportion?" "Yeah. I mean, we're talking about a few trees." 25, I cut in. "And counting." He hesitated. "Right. Okay, but still, this is something we can settle. You know, neighbor to neighbor." I almost laughed at that. "Neighbor to neighbor?" I said. "You sprayed poison over my fence line." "It wasn't intentional," he insisted. "You keep saying that like it changes anything." There was a pause, and then his voice dropped a little, less friendly now. "Look, Caleb, you don't want this to turn into something bigger than it needs to be." I straightened up. Too late. And that's when Rachel made her second move. She filed a civil lawsuit. Crop destruction, loss of income, property damage, and she didn't lowball it either. She calculated projected yield loss over the next several seasons, factoring in the maturity of those trees, replacement timelines, soil recovery. By the time she was done, the number wasn't something you brush off in a meeting. But she still wasn't finished. A few days later, she called me and said, "There's something else." I could hear it in her voice, that edge she gets when she's about to pull a thread that unravels everything. "What is it?" I asked. "Your property, and there's a creek running between them, right?" "Yeah," I said. "Small one feeds into the lower basin." She exhaled slowly. "That changes things. Turns out, the herbicide they used, the specific chemical compound, it wasn't just regulated, it was restricted near active water sources. Their development permit required a buffer zone, a no-spray area along that creek to prevent contamination." Rachel paused, then said, "If they sprayed up to the edge or over it." I felt my stomach drop a little. "They didn't just damage your orchard," she said quietly. "They may have contaminated water." That's when she contacted the county environmental health department. And everything escalated. Inspectors came out within 48 hours, not just one this time, but a team. They tested soil along the creek bank, then water samples upstream and downstream. I watched them work, quiet, methodical, same pattern as before, but heavier somehow, like the stakes had shifted. A week later, the results came back. Positive. Herbicide residue downstream. That's when the state environmental agency stepped in. Construction on Pine Ridge was halted immediately. No warnings, no grace period, just shut down. I drove up the ridge the next morning, parked where I could see the site. Half-built cabins sat there like abandoned shells, equipment idle. No workers, no noise, just wind moving through exposed framing. For the first time since this started, it felt like Darren wasn't in control anymore. And that was only the beginning. The day the site went quiet, that's the one that stuck with me. Not because it felt like a win, not exactly. More like the moment everything tipped past the point where it could ever go back to normal. Up until then, I think some part of me believed this would settle out, maybe a payout, maybe a formal apology if I pushed hard enough. But standing there, looking at those half-built cabins just sitting in silence, I realized this thing had grown into something a lot bigger than me and Darren arguing over a fence line. Within a week, the State Environmental Agency, what most folks just call the EPA, took over the investigation. Once they got involved, everything tightened up, more paperwork, more testing, more people asking very specific questions. They weren't interested in intentions or misunderstandings, they were interested in impact. And the impact was bad. The herbicide they used had made its way into the creek, just like Rachel suspected, not in small traces either, but in levels high enough to trigger mandatory remediation. That creek didn't just sit there looking pretty, it fed into a wider water system downstream, which meant now you weren't just talking about my land anymore. You were talking about potential environmental damage beyond property lines. Darren tried to get ahead of it. I'll give him that. He called me again, this time late in the evening, voice lower, more controlled, like someone who'd spent the whole day in meetings trying to put out fires. "Caleb, we need to talk," he said. I was sitting on my porch, watching the last light drop behind the ridge. "We've been talking," I replied. "No," he said, sharper this time. "We need to resolve this." I let that sit for a second. "You had a chance to resolve it. Things have escalated," he admitted. "Further than anyone expected." "Not anyone," I said quietly. "Just you." There was a long pause on the line, and when he spoke again, the edge was gone, replaced with something else, not quite desperation, but close. "Our contractor didn't follow protocol," he said. "They went outside the approved application area. We're handling it internally." I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. "That's not how this works, Darren. You're the permit holder. That responsibility doesn't just slide downhill to whoever you hired. We're willing to compensate you," he said quickly, like he'd been waiting to get to that part. "For the trees, for lost yield, we can make this right." I looked out toward the orchard, rows of trees still standing, but not the same, not untouched anymore. "You can't make it right," I said. "You can only pay for what you broke." Silence. Then he tried one last angle. "If this keeps going," he said, "it's not just going to hurt us." There it was, the closest he'd come to saying what he really meant. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. "You should have thought about that before you sprayed." And I hung up. After that, things moved without me needing to push them. The EPA issued formal penalties for water contamination. The county followed by revoking Pine Ridge's occupancy permits, not temporarily, but indefinitely, pending full cleanup and compliance verification. The state suspended their business license tied to the project. It stacked, one consequence on top of another, like a slow collapse you couldn't stop once it started. And then came the cost. Cleanup alone ran over $2 million, and that wasn't some abstract number on paper. That was excavation crews coming in, stripping away contaminated soil along the ridge and creek bank, hauling it out in trucks day after day. That was replanting native vegetation to stabilize the land. That was installing monitoring systems in the water, regular testing schedules locked in for years. 3 years, to be exact. 3 years of proving the damage had been contained. Investors started pulling out not long after that. You could see it in the way the site stayed empty, no new materials, no resumed work, just structures left exposed to weather. I heard through Rachel that financing dried up fast once the environmental violations went public. Nobody wants to sink money into a project tied up in regulatory issues with no clear timeline for resolution. Pine Ridge Retreat, this polished, high-end vision of rural escape, it never recovered. The last time I drove up there, weeds had started pushing through the gravel paths, wood framing had grayed under sun and rain, and what was supposed to be their centerpiece cabin just stood there unfinished, like a monument to bad decisions. It never opened. Not one day. Back on my side of the fence, things didn't magically fix themselves either. I lost more trees than I wanted to admit. Not all at once, but over the following months, some just couldn't recover from the exposure. Replanting takes time. Years before new trees even begin to produce the way the old ones did. There were mornings I'd walk the orchard and still feel that knot in my chest, thinking about what used to stand in certain spots, the rhythm of the rows before everything got disrupted. But the land, it's resilient, if you give it the chance. And so am I guess. One afternoon, not too long ago, I saw Tom Hensley again, the investigator from the Department of Agriculture. He stopped by while he was in the area, just checking in, seeing how things had settled. We walked the upper edge together, same place where all this started. He looked out over the valley, then back at the ridge where Pine Ridge sat unfinished. Hell of a view, he said. Yeah, I replied. He nodded toward the abandoned site. That what they were after? I thought about it for a second, about Darren standing there that first day, talking about unobstructed views like it was already his. Yeah, I said. I think it was. Tom shifted his weight, hands on his hips. Funny thing about cutting corners, he muttered. Sometimes you end up cutting out the whole thing. I let out a small laugh, not because it was funny, exactly more because it was true in a way that didn't need dressing up. Before he left, he paused by his truck and looked back at me. You did the right thing, he said. I didn't answer right away, because the truth is, I still think about that. Not whether what they did was wrong, that part's clear. But everything that followed, the scale of it, the fallout, the people who lost jobs when that project shut down, the ripple effect through the community. Justice doesn't always land clean. Sometimes it drags a lot of things down with it. And I wonder, if I'd taken Darren's offer early on, if I'd settled quietly, kept it between neighbors, would things have turned out differently? Would that resort be open right now, full of people taking pictures of a view that came at someone else's expense? Or would they have just done it again, to the next piece of land, the next person who didn't push back? I don't have a clean answer for that. All I know is they made a choice when they crossed that line, and I made mine when I refused to let it slide. So I'll leave it with you. If you were standing where I stood, looking at your land, your work, years of your life being wiped out for someone else's profit, would you have done the same thing? Or would you have taken the deal and let it go? Let me know what you think, because out here, right and wrong isn't always as simple as it sounds.